In the heart of Riyadh, behind the closed doors of a seemingly perfect family, a secret was brewing, a secret that would soon tear them apart. Samira, a devoted Muslim wife and mother of two, lived a life that, from the outside, looked ideal. She was married to Faisal, a successful businessman, and they had a modest but comfortable home in the bustling city of Riyadh. Faisal's business took him to other countries frequently, leaving Samira to handle the household and care for their children. Samira had married Faisal when she was just 20 years old in a traditional arranged marriage. In the beginning, their relationship was cordial. There wasn't much passion, but there was respect. They shared the responsibilities of family life, and everything seemed normal. Over time, however, as Faisal's business grew, so did his absences. Days turned into weeks, and even when Faisal was home, he was distant, focused more on his work than his family. As Faisal became more absorbed in his business, Samira felt increasingly alone. Despite fulfilling her role as a wife and mother, her heart felt empty. Her faith was strong, and she followed the teachings of Islam closely, praying daily for strength. But as the years passed, the loneliness only deepened, and Samira longed for emotional connection. It was during this period of isolation that Amir, Faisal's father, entered the picture in an unexpected way. Amir, a man in his early 60s, was respected both within his family and the community. Though older, he was still sharp and strong, always carrying an air of authority. Unlike Faisal, who hardly noticed the emotional distance in his marriage, Amir seemed to see right through Samira's pain. He noticed the growing gap between her and his son, but never spoke of it directly. At first, Amir's kindness to Samira was nothing unusual. He was generous with advice and always spoke with respect. Family gatherings were where they interacted the most, but soon their conversations became longer, more personal, and more frequent. Samira, starved for attention, found herself drawn to Amir's understanding nature. He complimented her, listened to her in ways Faisal never did, and over time, Samira began to feel seen. As their exchanges grew more intimate, a subtle shift began. What had started as a familial bond began to turn into something far more dangerous. Neither Samira nor Amir spoke openly about the feelings developing between them, but both felt the undeniable connection. Their secret bond was hidden under the cover of family gatherings, but deep down, both knew that the path they were on could lead to disaster. They just didn't know how close the disaster really was. The tension between Samira and Amir continued to build, unnoticed by the rest of the family. They saw each other frequently, but always under the pretense of family duties and gatherings. Amir's subtle gestures and knowing looks began to fill Samira's thoughts, even when he wasn't around. She knew it was wrong to feel this way, but the emotional void in her life had consumed her, and Amir was the only one who seemed to understand. It was during one of these family gatherings that everything changed. Faisal had been away on another long business trip, leaving Samira to handle their home as usual. Amir came over to the house, not for any official reason, just to visit and check on the family. He brought gifts for the children, spending time with them while Samira prepared tea. As the children ran off to play, Amir and Samira were left alone in the living room. The moment was filled with an unusual tension, the kind that neither of them could ignore any longer. Amir, as he often did, commented on how strong and graceful Samira was, despite all the challenges she faced in managing the household alone. She tried to brush off the compliment, but the truth of it hit her deeply. His words were more than just flattery now. They were a reflection of the emotional bond they had formed. Samira felt a strange mix of comfort and guilt. That day, the interaction between them crossed an invisible line. Amir moved closer to her, his presence overpowering. Though nothing explicit was said, it was clear to both of them that their relationship had now shifted into forbidden territory. The affection and attention Amir had shown her over the months had slowly built up to this moment, a moment neither of them could deny any longer. The emotional connection had turned into something more, something that could no longer be classified as innocent. Samira felt conflicted. She had always been a woman of faith, dedicated to her religion and her family. Yet here she was, drawn to her father-in-law in a way that was beyond anything she had experienced with Faisal. It wasn't just the lack of attention from her husband that led her here, it was Amir's understanding, his care, and the way he filled the void in her heart. For Amir, the attraction had developed gradually but had now grown into something undeniable. His son's neglect of Samira was obvious to him, and it had stirred something inside him that was both protective and possessive. He admired her strength and resilience, and over time, admiration had turned into something more dangerous, desire. In the days following that visit, Samira couldn't stop thinking about Amir. She was consumed by the guilt of her feelings and the fear of what they might mean for her family. Every time she prayed, she asked for forgiveness, begging for the strength to resist the temptation she was feeling. But the more she tried to distance herself, the harder it became. Amir's presence had awakened something in her that she couldn't ignore, no matter how hard she tried. Amir, too, found himself unable to pull back. He knew the danger of his actions, knew that this was a path that could lead to ruin. But the connection he felt with Samira was unlike anything he had ever experienced. She was not just his daughter-in-law anymore, she had become the center of his thoughts, and he felt powerless to stop it. Their secret relationship deepened in the weeks that followed. It was subtle, nothing overt or explicit, but the emotional intensity between them grew with each passing day. Each family gathering became an opportunity for stolen moments, brief touches, and meaningful glances that no one else noticed. But in their hearts, they both knew that this was only the beginning of something that could not stay hidden for long. The bond they shared was now undeniable, and though neither of them had spoken about it directly, they both understood the gravity of what was happening. They had crossed a line, and there was no turning back. As the weeks went by, the secret relationship between Samira and Amir deepened, though they never explicitly acknowledged it. It was a dangerous game, one built on unspoken desires and moments that only they understood. Their interactions, though subtle, carried a weight that threatened to unravel their lives. Amir began visiting Samira more often, using family matters as an excuse. He would bring groceries or help with errands that Faisal never bothered with. And though these visits seemed innocent to everyone else, they were filled with tension for Samira. The moments they spent together, even with the children around, grew more intense. Amir would find reasons to be close to her, brushing her arm as he passed or holding her gaze a little longer than necessary. For Samira, it was a whirlwind of emotions. She was both thrilled and terrified by what was happening. Amir made her feel seen in a way Faisal never did, but the guilt of their growing connection weighed heavily on her conscience. She spent many nights lying awake, thinking about the consequences of her feelings. She knew this was wrong, forbidden, and yet the pull she felt toward Amir was too strong to resist. Faisal remained oblivious to the tension brewing between his wife and father. His work kept him away most of the time, and when he was home, he was distant, focused on his phone or his business. He never noticed how Amir's visits had increased or how Samira had grown more withdrawn around him. To Faisal, everything was normal. His wife took care of the house and the children, and his father was a regular presence in their lives, as he had always been. The more Faisal distanced himself, the closer Amir and Samira became. Their shared understanding grew deeper, and with it, the boundary between right and wrong blurred. Samira began to rely on Amir not just for emotional support, but for companionship. They would spend time talking after the children went to bed, discussing everything from family matters to their personal struggles. These conversations, filled with unspoken emotions, created an intimacy that neither of them could deny. It wasn't long before their secret relationship began to evolve. One evening, after Amir had come over to help fix a broken appliance, the tension between them reached a tipping point. The children had already gone to sleep, and Samira was cleaning up the kitchen when Amir joined her. There was a charged silence in the air, a feeling they both recognized but had yet to act upon. Amir stood close to Samira, his presence overwhelming. She could feel the heat of his body next to hers, and for a moment they just stood there, not speaking, but understanding everything that needed to be said. The boundary they had danced around for so long was about to be crossed. The first touch was subtle, a gentle brush of Amir's hand against Samira's arm as she reached for a dish. It was an innocent gesture, but it sent a shock through both of them. Samira paused, her heart racing. She knew what was happening, and that if she didn't stop it now, there would be no going back. But as Amir moved closer, placing his hand gently on hers, the decision was already made. The line they had crossed emotionally had now become physical. Amir pulled Samira closer, and for the first time, they allowed themselves to acknowledge the feelings they had kept hidden for so long. It was a moment of both passion and fear of what this meant for their families, for their faith, and for the future. The days that followed were filled with a mix of excitement and dread. Their relationship, now fully physical, had moved beyond anything either of them had anticipated. They were careful, though, always meeting in secret, never letting anyone suspect what was happening between them. But the weight of their actions hung over them like a dark cloud, especially for Samira. She had always been a woman of faith, and now she was trapped in a situation that went against everything she believed in. Amir, too, struggled with guilt. He knew he was betraying his son, and that if anyone found out, it would destroy their family. But the bond he shared with Samira was too strong to break. Every time he tried to distance himself, he found himself drawn back to her. The more time they spent together, the deeper their connection grew, and the harder it became to stop. Samira's guilt began to affect her daily life. She found it difficult to focus on her responsibilities at home, and her relationship with Faisal grew even more strained. She avoided spending time with him, fearing that he might sense something was wrong. But Faisal remained oblivious, too preoccupied with his work to notice the changes in his wife. Despite the danger, Samira and Amir continued their affair. They were careful, making sure to meet only when they were sure no one would suspect. But the secrecy only heightened the intensity of their relationship. Every stolen moment felt more precious, and with each passing day, they became more entangled in their forbidden love. But deep down, both Samira and Amir knew that they couldn't continue like this forever. The guilt, the fear, and the risk of being discovered weighed heavily on them. They were living on borrowed time, and sooner or later, the truth would come to light. Faisal had been living with unease for weeks. His world, once stable and predictable, was beginning to feel like it was slipping through his fingers. Whispers had reached him, rumors about his father, Amir, and Samira. People spoke in hushed tones, exchanged knowing glances when they thought he wasn't looking. It gnawed at him, keeping him up at night, the idea that something dark and painful was happening behind his back. That fateful evening, Faisal couldn't take the uncertainty anymore. He made the decision to confront his doubts head-on. Coming home earlier than expected, his heart pounded as he neared the house. The streets, which he normally navigated with a calm mind, now felt like the setting of an impending disaster. His mind raced through possibilities, but he forced himself to push those thoughts away. Maybe the rumors were wrong. Maybe it was all a misunderstanding. As soon as Faisal entered the house, an oppressive silence greeted him. It wasn't the usual quiet of a peaceful home, but something heavier, thicker, as though the air itself was holding its breath. His eyes scanned the empty living room, and a strange feeling settled in his chest, a combination of fear and dread. Faisal's footsteps echoed down the hallway as he made his way toward his father's study. The door was slightly ajar, just enough for him to see into the dimly lit room. He hesitated for a moment before pushing it open. The sight that met his eyes felt like a punch to his gut. There, in the soft glow of the lamp, stood Amir and Samira. Their bodies were close, too close. They weren't speaking, but their embrace spoke louder than any words could. Amir held Samira, their faces inches apart. a gesture that couldn't be mistaken for anything but what it was. The truth hit Faisal hard, crashing over him in waves. The whispers were true. For a moment, Faisal couldn't move. He was paralyzed by the shock of betrayal, by the sight of the two people he trusted most in the world entwined in a way that tore through him. His mind reeled, struggling to process the scene in front of him. Then, out of the corner of his eye, Faisal noticed a decorative knife on the desk. It shimmered slightly in the dim light, an ornate piece that Amir had always kept as part of his collection. In that moment, the knife seemed to mock him, its intricate design standing in contrast to the chaos in his heart. Before Faisal even realized what he was doing, he grabbed the knife. It wasn't a thought-out decision. There was no time for that. It was a pure, raw reaction driven by the flood of emotions overwhelming him. The next moments were a blur. Faisal's rage boiled over, erupting in a torrent of shouting and anger. Samira cried out, trying to explain, but her words only fanned the flames of Faisal's fury. Amir tried to step forward, to calm his son, but the betrayal was too deep for words to fix. In a swift, uncontrollable motion, Faisal raised the knife and thrust it forward into Amir, his actions powered by the grief and hurt that consumed him. Glass shattered as the room descended into chaos. Samira's screams echoed off the walls, but Faisal barely heard them. His focus was on Amir, who staggered backward, his hand clutching at the wound in his chest. Blood poured from the injury, staining the floor beneath him. Amir's eyes widened in shock, the life slowly draining from him as he crumpled to the ground. Faisal stood frozen, staring down at his father's motionless body. His hand, now slick with blood from the incidents, was shaking. His breath came in short, ragged bursts as the enormity of what he had done began to sink in. The anger that had driven him moments ago evaporated, leaving behind only horror and disbelief. Amir lay lifeless, the knife lodged deep in his chest, and the room was filled with an eerie silence once again. Faisal's scream broke the stillness, a primal release of his anguish and horror. He stumbled backward, his vision swimming, unable to comprehend the full weight of what had just happened. The man who had raised him, the father he had loved and respected, was now dead by his own hand. In that instant, Faisal's life was irrevocably changed. His search for the truth had led him to a moment of madness, a moment where he had let his emotions take control. The consequences of that moment were now staring back at him as Amir lay lifeless on the floor. Guilt settled over him like a heavy cloak, and he knew that nothing would ever be the same. The police arrived soon after, alerted by the commotion, and Faisal was taken into custody. As he sat in the back of the police car, his mind was numb. He couldn't think, couldn't feel. The reality of what he had done had not fully hit him yet, but he knew that when it did, it would crush him. The trial that followed became the talk of the town. The story of a son who had killed his father in a fit of rage made headlines, and the courtroom was packed with people eager to witness the tragic downfall of a once respected family. Faisal's defense argued that he had acted in a state of temporary insanity, that the shock of discovering his father's betrayal had pushed him to the edge. The prosecution, however, painted a different picture, one of a premeditated act fueled by weeks of growing suspicion and anger. Faisal sat through the trial in a daze, barely able to process the arguments being made on his behalf. All he could think about was that night, the moment when he had let his emotions take over, and the life he had taken in that brief, explosive instant. In the end, justice was served, but it came at a great cost. Faisal was sentenced to a life of reflection, to live with the weight of his actions forever. The story of his downfall became a cautionary tale, a reminder of how unchecked emotions and impulsive decisions can unleash devastating consequences. Behind bars, Faisal lived with the constant reminder of that fateful night, haunted by the memory of his father's lifeless body and the terrible decision that had altered his path forever. The world outside moved on, but for Faisal, time stood still. In his quiet cell, Faisal spent his days reflecting on his actions. The regret was endless, and though the court had determined his guilt, it was the guilt within himself that weighed heaviest. No sentence could be harsher than the one he imposed on his own heart. His story, which once captivated the media, slowly faded from public memory, but for him it was a story that never ended. Each day, Faisal was reminded of how a single moment of uncontrolled emotion had destroyed everything he held dear. He had lost not just his father, but the life he had known. He had to carry the burden of his actions for the rest of his life, a constant, unshakable reminder of how tragedy can unfold in the blink of an eye.